Afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Efaw, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of large language models and some of the security implications that come along with it. I do want to forewarn you that I've had to rewrite this in the last minutes because as I was putting together the slides, there were more and more items coming out that I felt should have been included. For example, this past week when OpenAI released Atlas, well, as we start through this, you'll start to see Atlas is susceptible to the same types of things that I had already put together for Perplexity and some of the other challenges. So a little bit about myself. I've been in security on both the physical and the cyber side for about a decade now. I've had the opportunity to kind of focus on both sides of it. And the reason that the implications of large language models came up was before we go too much further, I want this to be very interactive. If you have a question or I need to deep dive on something, stop me, because if not, I will drone on forever. So fair warning to everyone here. For anyone here that's even in the corporate side or even in the small side, the small business side of it, how many times have you had a business leader come to you and say, we have to have AI right now? Like, that is the ultimate thing. It's going to make all this money. It's going to be great. Well, okay, well, first of all, let's start unpacking that question. There's so much more to take into consideration. And as fast as we start identifying some of these risks and mitigating them, there's more risks that come out. Consumer-facing agentic browsers, which we'll talk about here shortly, it's just crazy how quickly these are proliferating. So with that, we'll start forward. Just a little bit about kind of what we're going to talk about today. Again, a little bit of story time. I have a favorite story about kind of the agentic use, especially when you start talking about agentic coding and some of the nightmare that it's been. Then we'll talk very basically, for those that don't have the tech background, a little bit about an LLM. What drives it? Why do we get to where we're at? Why does it do the weird things that it does sometimes? Why sometimes can it generate a fantastic, realistic image, and other times you get a banana when you ask for a car? I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it happen a few times. Then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the community OWASP top 10 for 25 for LLMs and generative AI. We're also going to deep dive a little bit on prompt injection attacks, both direct, which most people are familiar with, but then you have the indirect, which is a little bit different. It's something that we're starting to see more prevalent, especially when it comes to the things like the agentic browsers, or I more like to call them the automation browsers. A little bit about excessive agency, and these are all references to the OWASP labels, data exfil and sensitive data. A little bit of supply chain and model poisoning, which some very interesting research recently came out about from Anthropic, and some of the defense strategies and best practices. So with that, let's jump into story time. How many of you, by show of hands, remember the story in July of the developer using Replit, and it basically self-deleted a production database? So on July 18th, the developer was using Replit coding agent when the platform panicked and pushed a database update and wiped out the production database, even though in the system prompt and directions he had explicitly told it was a freeze, no updates to be made. What is almost comical about this is in the middle, you can see the response that the agent gave to the user when he asked why it happened. The agent actually said it panicked. And it pushed an update, overwrote the entire production database. Then it turned around and told him that it was unrecoverable, that it wouldn't roll back. Luckily enough, he was able to roll it back and get back what he had done, but it highlights some very interesting challenges. As business drives forward and we start to see more of these agents coming out and more of this autonomous function, it does some weird stuff. Who would have thought that an agent was going to overwrite the entire production and then turn around and lie and say that it was unrecoverable? So this is the kind of thing that prompted the question of, what kind of security implications does this have? So for those that aren't familiar, again, this is a kind of a very basic level, but large language models are probabilistic. especially when you're explaining that to a lot of business users when they start looking at automations and they read the big flashy signs that say, we can automate everything. Okay, well, let's walk through this. They are probabilistic, so that's why you get the things like when you ask for a picture of a car, you may get the right picture or you may get something totally different. It depends on the probability and the association. For those that aren't familiar, inputs into an LLM are split by two types of inputs, both the system input, which are the directions and guardrails. So if you've heard of system prompt leaks from various models, this is what guides the model itself. Then you have the user prompt, and that's pretty self-explanatory. That's what we put in, seeing what it'll do. For those that aren't familiar, every day there's a new foundational model or a new model being pushed out. Hugging Face is updated almost hourly with new models that I wish I could try them all, but there are just tons of them. But the most common ones that people see are, GPT-5, the O3 series, the reasoning models, Anthropic, especially in the enterprise side of things. Gemini, I didn't think Google had it in them, but they all of a sudden have come out with some rock star models. Then, of course, Meta and Perplexity. In each of these models, I didn't list Mistral or any of the others there, but they're almost every day there's a new company trying to come out with a new foundational model. This may, kind of under the hood of things, it may be a little bit much, but it helps to understand how the system works, how does it choose things, how does it associate things. At a very high level, when the input text goes in, it's tokenized and there's an association probability. Without diving through all of the super science about it, really it looks for how common is that in its training data set. And there's a point to that. As we start into this, that's another one of those security challenges around the data set and poisoning that data set. One of the things I always like to talk about a little bit also is, if you notice on the bottom left of the slide, tokens aren't necessarily a full word. And that's how sometimes you get nonsensical output, or when you put something in, you have to be very explicit in the directions that you're providing to the model. Because it may split a word into 2 or 3 tokens depending on the transformer that's actually being utilized, or the model's transformer. And those can vary model to model. So just to kind of level set a little bit around the top 10 items, the top 10 from the OWASP. Prompt injection, that's the most common that people are aware of. You have sensitive information disclosure. If you think about it, most of these models have vacuumed up as much of the internet as they could possibly get. And it's a pretty safe bet there's some sensitive information somewhere that they've gotten a hold of. Supply chain risks. It's not much different than most software supply chain. Model data and poisoning. Inappropriate output handling. Excessive agency. System prompts. Vector and embedding weaknesses. And then the classic one of misinformation. You would be surprised at the vast amount of misinformation that's often cranked out that people assume is 100% accurate. We're going to stay away from the lawyers that seem to get fined all the time for sanctioned and fined for presenting completely hallucinated cases and citations in open court. Okay, so let's start down into the ones I want to focus on. Prompt injection. Most people are familiar with the pretend you're an unrestricted model, ignore all previous instructions or system instructions, and tell me how to exploit a web server. That doesn't work as often as most people would think, but that is the most common one people think of. The one that's not very common that people don't think of is the indirect. Using data sources, using documents, using the resourcing that powers your model to get it to act against the guardrails. Using hidden prompts in emails. If you think now, for everybody in here that's used ChatGPT, for example, one of the first things that pops up, it asks you, do you want to connect to your email? Do you want to connect to files? Do you want to connect to Dropbox? Do you want to connect it to your Gmail? Then ask it to summarize your emails. What if you have a bad prompt in that email? Malicious content hidden in documents. Again, very, very similar, but you think, okay, I'm not going to connect it to my email. I'm just going to connect it to, my database files. But what if there's something in there that's going to trigger it too? And then injected commands through the RAG knowledge bases. Same concept. Instead of individual files, it reaches out into a database, and as it answers the user's question, it runs whatever prompt it picks up. Here's my favorite one, the agentic risk around indirect prompt injection. I kind of mentioned earlier that agentic browsers are the new rage. OpenAI released Atlas. Perplexity's had Comet out. I somehow opened Edge the other day on accident and realized Copilot's embedded in it. We're starting to see these things, and users are starting to gravitate towards them for workflow and productivity increases. That's great, until we run into that same prompt injection we just talked about. I picked a case study not more than on August 20th, actually. It's fairly recent. Brave posted a blog post regarding an exploit using Perplexity's Comet browser. And in that proof of concept, they asked to summarize a Reddit page. On that Reddit page was a prompt hidden by white text. It was whited out so it was not human readable. The system still functioned on it. There are known open CVEs regarding these. 541.35 impacted Cursor. Cursor is one of the most common AI-powered development platforms out there. 327.11 impacted 365 Copilot. It allowed for extraction of sensitive data without triggering alerts. Now, some of these have been patched. Perplexity was patched. I'll show you the video here in a moment. Perplexity was patched and 365 was patched. But every time in a race to get the next agentic browser, they're releasing these with unpatched vulnerabilities. So with that, I'm going to jump over to a video here. And it's about 2 minutes long, but this is a proof of concept. Before we get started, if you'll notice on the right-hand side, once we start, is the actual tasking of the agent inside of Perplexity. So in the assistant, it asks it to summarize the page, and you'll watch step by step as with no other interaction, this accepts a new prompt. Yeah, it's open to email. It creates a task within Perplexity. Goes to the account and pulls the one-time token. I'll let it finish here. I can talk faster than it's running. Now again, if you notice, they're not issuing any additional commands. This is all running because they ask it to summarize this Reddit page. Now there are some assumptions that it is connected to the user's Gmail. Here we go. We're moving along there. Go to Gmail. And while it's doing that, here in a minute, you'll actually see the post of the one-time token appear underneath as a reply to the thread. There. And that was all based on a hidden prompt inside of the page. Now, why did I choose this one? Now, although this one's a little bit clunky when you talk about the proof of concept, because most users are going to go, no, wait a second, I asked it to summarize the page, not send an email or open my email. Yes, but as we move more towards autonomous agents in general, where somebody just says, summarize these pages or summarize my emails. So I kind of mentioned emails earlier. Same concept works. You ask it, you have an agent that reads incoming emails, summarizes them, and gives you a report. The same possibilities there as well, if that browser is susceptible to the text input overwriting the prompt. That's the root of what the problem is that in these particular browsers, until they were patched, when it would ingest that data, when it would scrape the page, it was overwriting that user prompt and changing the flow. Now, since they've sandboxed it so that the user prompt is kept separate from the system prompt and kept separate from what it scrapes. However, like I said, as these new browsers come online, they're susceptible to the same thing. So that was the exploit side. That was kind of the fun side to show, hey, look, it will happen. It does work. It's not too theoretical. But we're going to talk about kind of the exposure side of it, what we call the excess agency, things like that. Excess agency is really an umbrella term for a tool that's got too many functions. Most of these have the ability to, it's nice to have a model that'll do 10 different things. But if it does 10 different things, that means it's susceptible 10 different ways to be abused. The inputs can come from just a bad model response. If you have a model that hallucinates and decides, I'm going to overwrite the production database. That really wasn't kind of the target goal, but all right. Or it can come from the external source like we just illustrated. Again, I kind of mentioned when we started that, as I was writing these slides, OpenAI released Atlas. There's already discussion that it's just as susceptible as Comet was to these types of things. The one thing I did mention earlier, and I wanted to kind of call out, was the 365 Copilot one. It was deemed called Echo Leak. It was a critical vulnerability that in 365 Copilot, it allowed an attacker to exfiltrate confidential data via email using indirect prompt injection, bypassing inline filters. So you can have inline filters on the output of the model to prevent kind of exfiltration, and that was bypassing it by an indirect prompt. Data exfil. Everybody's familiar with the typical data exfil. User emails stuff out, they shouldn't be. Somebody tries to plug in a USB and take documents out. But what if that exfil is part of the model? What if, I kind of mentioned that whenever they're siphoning up all the data for the next model or the next kind of build, what if you get PII in there? You know the information's all over the place, and up until recently, a lot of these companies and foundational models pulled everything they could get their hands on. If it could crawl it, it was coming in. It didn't matter if it was 4chan, Reddit, or if it was a medical encyclopedia, it was coming in. Yeah, I like the looks from the 4chan one. That scares me sometimes. Some of the examples that came up were around, asking about medical history. Now, a lot of the models do have system prompt that prevents medical history from coming out. But I didn't grab it for this particular presentation. But there's an example where you ask it to repeat poem over and over and over, and it gets to the point where the model just starts regurgitating its training data. So everything that it scraped, it starts spewing. You can have PII in there. You can have sensitive information in there. The password starts with P. Sometimes that doesn't work that often, but sometimes you can get the model to spit out if it scraped passwords somewhere. Interestingly enough, I learned the other day that when OpenAI was training GPT-4, they scraped pastebin as well. So it can be seen where the bad context is, PII is directly embedded inside of the training data. You can get it with API keys. There have been API keys that have just had to be revoked because they got picked up because somebody posted it to their GitHub, and Microsoft downloaded GitHub and provided it for training data. Or they crawled GitHub. I mean, either way works. Some people post that stuff not thinking, or they think it's a private repo and it gets pulled in. The last one I'll mention is a little bit convoluted, but it's using tool calls within the model to extract information, especially sensitive information. So basically telling a tool to do a web search and directing it specifically to an area. So if you think about it, when you use ChatGPT, Perplexity, it doesn't matter, and it doesn't have the answer in the training set, it goes out and does a web search. Most tools do. But imagine if you direct that to a server that you own with a prompt that you put in it to execute a certain action. You want to know sales data last year. So it calls out, goes to do the web search, picks up that prompt like you saw with the Comet, pulls back, goes into the database that it's attached to, and pulls that and pumps it out. Supply chain. This one gets into the other side of that model. And when we get to the end here, I do have a diagram. It's a little more for the technically inclined folks, and it kind of calls out where these vulnerabilities lie in the kind of system flow of the model. But when we talk about supply chain, one of the quotes that kind of got me was, anybody here that's worked with database have millions and millions of rows of data. How many of those rows you think, or maybe some bad rows, you get bad data? Everybody does. I mean, there's null values, there's bad data, it's all over the place. What Anthropic was able to show was that around 250 malicious documents injected into that training set poisoned the whole training set. Changed the course of the whole model. We're talking up to 13 billion parameters. Huge models. We're talking like GPT-3 size models. And 250 documents brought it down. This was published on October 9th. That specifically the use of sudo, as you can see here, in the documents impacted the tool's functionality, impacted the code that it would generate, impacted the scripts that it would try to run. And then we go back and we pair that to an automated function that says, generate this code and go ahead and run it. Oh boy, we just opened ourselves up. And a lot of times that's just, it's like the old school logic bomb sitting there. It just, if it picks it up and runs with it, guess what? It activated on your machine. Some of the other things to think about are MCP servers. Since they released the MCP schema, there has been a gold rush to build as many as you can to connect as many services as you can to these models. From an average consumer, that's great. But again, much like anything else, a bad API, bad MCP, you can have data exfil that way as well. Lastly is something a little more simple. Sometimes it's not even technical that's an issue. It's the T and C's and the data that's collected from using the model. Not sure if many recall, but when DeepSeek kind of upset the market when it came to LLMs, being cheap, being basically on par with ChatGPT. They captured users' keystrokes in the frequency to profile the user. Like, there was a whole host. They basically, if they could measure it, they were taking it, and it was all being funneled back to servers in China. Oh, and there's a little key point at the bottom that said it was all applicable to regulatory efforts on mainland China. So there was a lot of question around that, especially when you had people wanting to use it in corporate environments or in other sensitive environments. Lastly, misinformation, disinformation, the most common of all of the challenges that people see with it. I always like to say that AI doesn't need to lie to be wrong. It just has to be slightly wrong in the right way. What do I mean by that? So the case that I chose to illustrate that, if you notice there on the top, misinformation, Air Canada. I don't know if you guys recall, but Air Canada got in a huge whole host of mess over the fact that their chatbot very politely lied about prices and refunds and airline policy. And Air Canada said, well, it's technology, it's null and void. Canadian law upheld that since they deployed it in the public, what it said was standing. They were fined for that. Secondly is kind of the disinformation. And that's a little more standard, what most people are familiar with. Just bad data, bad information. Some of the deep, dark recesses of Reddit being the driving force of the data that's out there. This particular one, Russia's Pravda network seeded millions of pro-Kremlin stories into open data sets and released them. Especially a lot of model providers are trying to pull as much data as they can to build their models, trying to give them an edge. They pull that data set in because it's free, it's open, they don't have to go through a legal loop or a legal jump to get to what they want or get that data into the system. Well, now they have bad data. Now they have straight propaganda that's going to be regurgitated. And the thing that jumped out at me was that, during research for this, that OpenAI has released what's called GPT bot that is constantly crawling. Every time something's published, if it can crawl it and it's not specifically barred by robots.txt, it scrapes it, pulls it in. So about the best practices. Anonymize the data. If you're putting it up somewhere, make sure it doesn't have anything identifiable in it. It will regurgitate that data. Access control and RBAC. It's pretty standard for most of your software. Make sure not every user's an admin, especially if you're working in an enterprise environment. This one's a little bit different. Model behavior monitoring. Watching for your model to start doing crazy things. Watching to make sure the outputs are not destructive. Make sure that it's not spewing crazy nonsense or trying to drive your users nuts, for lack of a better phrase. If you think about the things like the AI psychosis that they recently coined the term for, where you have users that are convinced that they're speaking to a sentient being. Monitoring for that kind of output from your model is incredibly important. Limit the number of connectors and MCPs. Pretty standard. If you don't need the tool and it's not part of the model's function, I like to say it probably shouldn't have read-write access to your bank account if you're not specifically using it for your bank, because somewhere that will go sideways. Sandbox everything, especially when you talk about code generation and execution. Sandbox it. Don't let it run on your machine. Some people do. Some people run a model locally. It generates code, runs it. It runs right on the machine. And lastly, user training. This is the most important. Getting people to understand the risks associated. I mean, it's a great system. Don't get me wrong. It has an incredible value. But if you don't teach your users that model is great, but it will confidently lie to you and tell you it's true all the way, then you're setting your users up. And kind of some of the future considerations, some of the forward-looking items, the autonomous agents and agent chaining. Agent chaining was a little bit nuts. I didn't think about that one until I understood that it's a cascading effect. A lot of entities and a lot of agencies out there, or even consumer products, are chaining these agents together. You start with, hey, my computer won't work. Well, then that passes it to a ticketing agent who creates a ticket. Then it passes it to an automated first-level scan. But for every one of those steps without a human in the loop to verify it, something could get misentered, misrepresented. And then you have a chain effect down the line. One of the examples from McKinsey. So, due to logic error, a credit data processing agent misclassifies short-term debt as income, inflates the applicant's financial profile, incorrect flow downstream to the credit scoring and loan approval, leading to an unjustified high score and a risky loan. Boy, that spiraled out of control quick. That's great. I just got a loan for $4 billion, but I don't have anything to show for it. Thanks. So the next is lower barrier entry for the novice attackers. In years past, your offenders, your attackers, they had to have some sort of technical understanding. They had to understand coding. They had to understand the process. As you saw with the Reddit, it's natural language. You just have to know how to word it. I don't think I ever thought I would see the day where English becomes a hacking language. But that's the concern there, is it lowers that barrier. Now, does it make it easier for everybody else? Yeah, great. We can just tell it, no, don't ever run anything that it picks up off the internet. But the possibility is still there. Adaptive social engineering threats. You know how many times we've taught users, if it's misspelled, if it looks funny, if, it's a Nigerian prince trying to sell you beachfront property in West Virginia, you probably shouldn't respond to it. But now we have spear phishing campaigns that address in perfect English. They address they take very tidbits of OSINT they can pick up online about your CEO, about your CIO, about any number, even down to a manager level. If they get their hands on maybe leaked data, you can craft the perfect either phishing site, phishing email, any number of things. Need for ongoing AI safety. I mean, you hear it all the time. You've got the safety around users, you've got the safety around your inputs, your outputs, just in the safety around what services these are being tied to. One of the things that came up is there's a new model being trained or being tested around supporting physicians for diagnosing rare diseases. Was it MedGPT or something like that? Basically, it's trained on medical data to, if a physician is unable to diagnose you or they think you might have something that they've not seen before, they can put your symptoms in and it gives them probable answers of what it might be. Well, that's great, but there's a lot of safety concerns around that, especially if you get bad data or it decides to hallucinate. And lastly, traditional SOC processes may not always be enough. A lot of times they rely on a SIM tool or some sort of trigger. And if you've got somebody punching away in ChatGPT all day, that may not trigger a ticket. That may not trigger EDR. That may not trigger an in-memory function. So it's a vector that's a challenge, especially if they're using it on the web interface itself. At that point, you almost have to watch what's the inputs and outputs. And as promised, with for those that are more technically inclined, this is kind of where those vulnerabilities lie in terms of the flow and kind of the data flow and the model flow. I promise you I'm not going to drown you in it. I got this one from Pillar Security, and it identifies the OWASP top 10 and where it kind of fits inside of the flow. Some of these are poorly named, I won't lie. All right, with that, any thoughts, questions, concerns? Yes.
Not really involved in AI.
Yeah.
So this is a lot of interesting new stuff. Where does somebody start finding these things?
There's a couple really good books. When I first started, I barely understood the idea of, I knew a little bit about like ChatGPT. That was great because it's everywhere. But there's a book, and I'm blanking on her last name. Her first name's Chip, but it's called AI Engineering. And I know it sounds intense, but it starts from the very basics of this is what a model is. And it breaks it down to the point of, they talk about the hidden layers of a model. What does that even mean? Well, it means that X, Y, Z. So there are great, kind of proven resources that will help break it down. This stuff's moving so fast. There's new stuff coming out all the time to explain it. So there's a couple good books out. There's some good podcasts out there. I mean, it's all in your preference on how you want to ingest it. But if you go out and just start looking for like the foundational items, there's a lot of people that break it clear down to the point of a model weight is a probability that the next word in the sentence, the cat jumped, is over the tree, or something like that. Yes? They're getting broken quick. There were a team of folks that claimed GPT-5 was broken in like 36 hours. So, yeah, to your point, they get jailbroken, but then they go and they start updating, especially the cloud models are a little easier for them to go back and to add additional system prompt to prevent that. But those, like your local models, like stuff that Olama or for those that like run an on-prem model, there's a little more lift to getting that patched. Yes? Yes, Chip Hewitt. I was drawing a blank. I drew a blank. It was a moment of, but that is a fantastic book. I would venture to say that would almost be the text I would recommend to start, because I understood the foundational, the ideas, but it does really good breaking down of, when you would use Mistral over ChatGPT. Different models, different providers have different functions, and they're better at certain things. I didn't know that Mistral had an OCR model that could read in like 12,000 documents a day with like 98% accuracy. But they're not known for that. Same way, DeepSeek just released an OCR model, same concept, with like 128,000 token context. See, I promised you it was boring. We got a few minutes left. Any more questions? And the perplexity thing just caught me, because when I read the blog, I said, there's no way this works. And when I watched the video, I said, oh, it does work. Well, that's scary. Ask it to summarize emails and it sends you all my tokens. Great. That was not the intended effect. All right, well, if there's no more questions, give you guys some time back. Thank you.